Hi colleagues, this is Ricardo Mak from the Hong Kong Baptist University. Today I have the opportunity to share with you my idea about the emergence of a spiritual dimension in Chinese martial arts in the late 19th century. So let's start with some assumptions. We always believed that Chinese martial arts, since its emergence approximately 4,000 years ago, has gradually developed into a holistic system with a lot of elements, including fighting skills, physical exercise, virtues, and spiritual cultivation. So we find the following passage is a very typical description of the Chinese martial art. This is from a book from Wei Hai, 中国古代武术, a book published in 1993. I quote, Chinese martial arts, which bring entertainment, physical exercise, combative skills, and philosophy perfectly together into a coherent whole, surpass the Western and East Asian counterparts in almost every aspect. So Chinese martial arts are really great. So at the same time, people keep emphasizing the nei and wai, inner and exterior aspects of the Chinese martial arts. In Chinese, 在外为拳，在内为气. Fist fighting as external expression, energy as internal strength. This is also from a similar book on Chinese martial arts. So what is Qi? Qi stands for self-cultivation by means of self-consciousness with the aim to continuously professionalize our life activities. This means Chinese martial arts train your interior as well as exterior part of the body. So I just mentioned about the assumptions about the Chinese martial art. Then what is my argument? So this paper argues that some practical virtues of Chinese martial artists result from social and business reasons. Spiritual cultivation became an essential component of Chinese martial arts as late as in the 19th century. That means the spiritual cultivation part came much later, and the fighting skill and other part of a Chinese martial art emerged much earlier. So, when talking about Chinese martial arts interior side, we always emphasize the Chinese martial virtues. So I quote again, it is widely believed that Asian martial cultures primarily result from some forms of interaction between Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism. That means all these are cultural resources for the interior part of Chinese martial arts. So what are these things, including from Confucianism, the gentleman ideals of a lot of good things, of wisdom, honesty, etc. On the other side, the ultimate goal of Chinese martial arts is to achieve the Confucian goal, 成德, achieving moral perfections through the way of either 道问学, seeking the way through learning, or 专德性, preserving our moral nature and eventually reach the ideal of moral excellence. That means this is the ideal of Confucianism, and this ideal was carried into Chinese martial art. On the other side, Buddhism is also a very important part of the Chinese martial arts. Just imagine the influence of the Shaolin Temple. Yeah, you can guess that Buddhism should be a very important element of the Chinese martial arts. And Taoism, yeah, be water, my friend. Yeah, that means harmony with the ways. So that means, if you think about Taoism, the relationship between Taoism and the Chinese martial arts, immediately you think about Tai Chi, Xing Yi Quan, etc. All these elements, as I said, should be important elements of the Chinese martial art. That means from the ancient times, spiritual dimension already exists in the Chinese martial arts. So let me focus on the studies of Pre-Ming Chinese martial arts, because before the Ming Dynasty, of course, there were sources about the development of Chinese martial arts, but these sources are very scanty, and not enough for us to pursue in-depth studies. The Ming Dynasty, due to the development of the publication industry, we found a lot of new books, new publications, which were about the Chinese martial arts. And at the same time, some martial artists began to record the stories about Chinese martial artists, about major theories of the Chinese martial arts. And that's why Ming Dynasty should be the right time for us to begin with the studies of the Chinese martial art. Then before that, what do we have? We have some explanation about the military martial arts. That means military system, recruitment, training, equipment, and general and soldiers, tactics and tacticians, etc. Other than that, we have very little. The civilian martial arts about fixed forms, acrobats, and paramilitary groups, and these are what we have about Chinese martial arts. And of course, the myth of the Shaolin Monastery was also a very important things for us to further consider. And Qigong, yeah, I guess you know about Qigong, but at that time, it was only a side issue. Of course, they are medical practitioners paying attention to Qi, about the inner energy of new human beings, but these are not mentioned in Chinese martial arts classics. So, a very typical narrative at that time is no matter what, a Chinese martial arts should be a holistic system that includes everything. And that's why people try to look into the ancient classics about the interrelationship between the fighting skills and the interior part of Chinese martial arts. And that's why we find a very interesting phenomenon. The people try to relate, let's say, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism with Chinese martial art, and they assume that these elements should be inherent parts of the Chinese martial arts since the very, very early times. So here I quote a book, yeah, it's mentioned about the influence of Yin and Yang and the impact on Chinese martial art. Yin and Yang, I guess you know a bit about this. Then Yin represent dark and negative and tenderness, and Yang represents bright, positive, and power. So these are complementary, interconnected, and independent, and they together form the natural world. So these things are quite similar to what we always talk about the Chinese martial art. We have the soft power, the hard power. We also have the dark side and the bright side, etc. So that should be, this idea exists for a long time, and that's why Chinese martial arts should also include these elements. Then how about Confucian virtue of moderation? That means we should not be too extreme. Men should not be too extreme. They should be stand in the middle. So this is important idea of Confucianism, and this should also be important part of the Chinese martial art. So when talking about the fixed forms and weapon sets and combat skills in China in the ancient times, all people also related this element with to the ideas that I have just mentioned about. So then how about Shaolin Monastery? Did Shaolin Monastery really the origin of the Chinese martial arts? Did Buddhism really exert great influence over Chinese martial art? So let me start with some elementary stories. Many of you heard about the Yi Jing Jing and the Xue Dian. Many of you also heard about Damo. And I think these elements became the important part of Chinese martial arts, particularly the Shaolin Monastery. But all these were proved to be fabricated in the late 17th century. Yeah, we believe that Damo came to China before the Qing Dynasty at about the 5th Dynasty time, at about the 9th century, and he stayed sometimes in the Shaolin Monastery in Henan. And he left behind two very important books, two important training manuals, which eventually became the origins of the Shaolin martial arts. But all these were proved to be fabricated things in the late 17th century. So it remained only a myth. So then how about, but we still believe that a lot of martial arts came from Shaolin Monastery. It's true, but according to a Japanese martial art historian, Shaolin Monastery was not the origin of Chinese martial arts. It was a hub where different kinds of Chinese martial arts came together, because at that time, outlaws, robbers, and some other bad people tried to find shelters in Shaolin Monastery in Henan, and they came together and exchanged their skills. Eventually, Shaolin Monastery became a hub for the differentiation and collection of Chinese martial arts. So, in fact, given the very, very little sources we have, this story of quan qian he yi, the interaction of martial arts and Buddhism, was really, really hard to explain. We knew much too little about this. So then how about Tai Chi and Wudang? And perhaps you heard about the story of Zhang Sanfeng, who was the founder of the Wudang and who was also the major practitioner of Taiji, and some even believe that he was the founder of the Taiji school. But if we look at the historical sources, we find that he was only an obscure figure in the Song Dynasty. And some people believe that he was from the Ming Dynasty. Song Dynasty was from about the 11th century to the 13th, then 11th century, and then the Ming Dynasty, 14th century. Or how can a person live that long from the Song Dynasty to the Ming Dynasty? So how can we believe that he was really the founder of Wudang and Tai Chi? But some Taoist thinkers also practice martial arts. For instance, we heard about Laozi, the founders of the Taoist schools. He mentioned a little bit about sword fighting, but that's all we know about the relations between the Taoism and Chinese martial arts. And other than that, we have nothing. So Zhang Sanfeng, let's forget about him. So it was as late as in Republican China that in the 20th century that Zhang Sanfeng was eventually seen as the grandmaster of Tai Chi. Before that, before the 20th century, nobody related him to Tai Chi and Wudang. In Confucianism, does Confucianism also exert any influence on the Chinese martial arts? Okay, we can refer to Confucian's gentleman ideal. That means the ideal of all-rounded man, well-rounded man, that a person should know different kinds of skills, including music, archery, writing, mathematics, etc. And then all these came together to make a man a real all-rounded person. So Confucians talk about this, and he also always carried a sword, and some of his disciples were good in fighting skills, and that's why we believe that martial arts should be an important part of Confucianism. And moderation should be the highest ideal of Confucianism. So the ideal of moderation should also be a part of the Chinese martial arts. Then do we have any other elaboration? No. So here, I just talk about the three major cultural resources of the spiritual dimension of the Chinese martial arts. But as I said, before the late 19th century, all these elements were not integrated into the Chinese martial arts system. At least I would say that there was no evidence telling us that these elements were integrated into the Chinese martial arts system. We heard little Chinese martial artists really talking about these. We also heard little Chinese thinker highly regard the values of the Chinese martial arts. But even the Literati-Martial artists also said very little about the spiritual dimension of Chinese martial arts. So a very important era in the studies of Chinese martial arts was the Ming Dynasty. As I said, I talked a bit about the background just a few minutes ago. So in the 16th century, there were a group of Chinese martial artists, Qi Jiguang, Wu Shu, and Bi Kun. These people were generals, and they fought in different battles. At the same time, they were literati, and they knew a lot of different kinds of ideas and theories. And they were the first group of people who tried to pursue in-depth studies into the Chinese martial arts from an academic perspective. But at that time, Qi Jiguang, who wrote the very important book, 绩效新书, just mentioned a little bit about different kinds of fixed forms because he was a general. He paid particular attention to military skills in the battlefield, and the spiritual dimension was still not an important part of his idea. And Wushu, he wrote a very important part, an important book, 手臂录. In this book, he began to talk about different schools of martial arts, different schools of Chinese martial arts. He mentioned about different fighting skills, but spiritual dimension was still non-existent in his book. And the first person, Bi Kun, talk about yin-yang, spirit and energy. He, in fact, was the person that we need to pay attention to, and he talked about training the body as well as the soul, but these ideas were not fully elaborated in his work. So here, I use Shaha's synthesis to let you know or strengthen my argument. If modern combat is not only a fighting method, but also a system of thought, then it is not surprising that its evolution was partially spurred by intellectual development. It was as late as its late Ming Dynasty, 16th and 17th century, that such kind of synthesis came up. And the last 4 sentences, as leading scholars began to practice folk martial arts, they rewrote them into a sophisticated language. So it was as late as in the late Ming and early Qing Dynasty, that means in the 17th century, that such kind of synthesis began. But I would say that this synthesis also did not last long. Throughout the whole Qing Dynasty, that means before the late 19th century and the early 20th centuries, such kind of studies were not very widespread, and only a small group of people were interested in this. So here, I quote a very important person, Huang Zhongxi, and he was believed to be a grandmaster who distinguished neijia quan, the interior form and exterior form of the Chinese martial arts, that means external forms and internal forms. But he only wrote a few sentences about this. Of course, he talked a bit about the very special fighting skill acupons, but what he talked about neijia quan, interior form and exterior form, was very, very not extensive. For him, external form is a kind of fighting skill that always took the initiative to attack, and neijia quan, interior form, was another kind of martial arts that wait until the enemy attacks and wait for the opportunity to fight back. That's all. So up to this point, I would say that the so-called interior form, exterior form, fighting skill, and spiritual dimension were not a core of the studies and practice of Chinese martial arts. And the spiritual dimension emerged much later than we imagine. So the Ming Dynasty and the Qing Dynasty gave a very good opportunity for the popularization of martial arts. So for instance, at that time, the Japanese pirates always attacked the Chinese coast, and that's why the local people organized their own military groups to fight back. And that's why martial arts penetrate different parts of the societies. And apart from the attack from the Japanese pirates, there were always unrest. And in the Qing Dynasty, the Han people tried to fight against the Qing invaders, and that's why there were anti-Qing activities throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. That means that another opportunities for the militarization of the Chinese society. And one of the leading groups was the Tiandi Hui, Society of Heaven and Earth. And this, I would say that the Tiandi Hui was the major organization that really transformed the myth of Shaolin martial arts. It was through them that Shaolin martial arts became very popular, and different schools, particularly in southern part of China, attribute their origins to Shaolin Temple. So in the late 18th century, the pirates came again, and that's why, just like in the Ming Dynasty, the local groups organized their fighting groups to counter the attack of the pirates. So all these create a good opportunity for the popularization of Chinese martial arts. I think these are the byproduct and consequence of the popularizations of Chinese martial art. There were different martial arts or violent professions, just like escorts, 保镖, and 保甲, 保镖, bouncers, local militia, and there were growing demands for martial artists. And as I just mentioned, there were growing demand for militarization of local community, and that's why they need grandmaster to teach the common people martial arts to protect themselves. And some professional also came to work for the rich people, and that's why all these professions became very popular in 18th century China. So, are these what we call the spiritual dimensions of Chinese martial arts? Yeah, here these are some martial virtues for the layman, which were popularized by the groups of people I've just mentioned about, but still not bewilder, my friend, still not Buddhism, still not moderation or gentleman ideal of Confucianism. But these people, these martial artists, eventually create a kind of very layman virtues, just because these people work for the general public, and they need to have the fighting skill, but at the same time, they need to behave well so as to save themselves and to allow their business to continue. And that's why the very layman martial virtues came to shape in the 18th century. So, but these differ very tremendously from what I have just said, the Buddhism, Taoism, or Confucianism. They emphasize on 真材实料, having real skills and strength. 专师重道, showing respect to seniors. 谦厚待人, to be humble and tolerant. 先礼后兵, violence as the last resort. 以和回贵, peace as the highest value. Oh, so these are the virtues and the spiritual values of these martial artists. But you cannot relate them to Buddhism, Taoism, or Confucianism. These are for laymen, for the people working in the violent economy. So 19th century was a century of tremendous changes for China. It was the time when China, faced with the Western challenges and modern warfare, characterized by modern weapons, finally came to China. And China lost a number of important wars against its Western counterparts. For instance, the First and Second Opium War, and the war against Japan in the year 1894, etc. So China could no longer stand up against the Western challenge militarily. So then how about the Chinese martial arts? Now, the Western soldiers came to China carrying the modern weapons. Then could the Chinese martial artists, using their sword, using their arrows to fight against these Western invaders? So it was the time when China also developed their new military units. Then when even the Chinese government now turned to modern military training, then what were the values of Chinese martial arts? So some other changes also were not favorable for the continuous development of Chinese martial arts. For instance, a more westernized and civilized lifestyle came to shape, and the people talk about more civilized manners and settle disputes and conflict by law. Then the people no longer turn to fight in case of confrontation between them. So, what was the use of Chinese martial arts? So, of course, if one important thing is that China's after losing a number of wars against the Western counterpart, and after seeing that Chinese technology surpassed China in many different ways, some thinkers turned to reassess the values of Chinese civilization in the modern times. So then how about Chinese martial arts? Were they still useful in this new time? So we find in this era, some martial artists came to the front to talk about the spiritual side of Chinese martial art. I mentioned about 3 masters who have similar backgrounds. The first one is Lutang. He was born in Hebei, and he knew Yi Jing, the Chinese, one of the Chinese Confucian classics, and he also know quite a bit about the Buddhist ideas, but he practiced Chinese martial arts, including Xing Quan, and Taiji. And other person, Chen Xin, also born in the northern part of China in Henan, he practiced the Chen style Taiji Quan, and he also passed the first level of civil service examination. And finally, Xue Dian, also born in Hebei and a practitioner of Xing Quan. These people practice what we call interior style of Chinese martial arts. At the same time, they were well-educated people, so they practiced Chinese martial arts and try to use a sophisticated language to create a new system, a theoretical system for the Chinese martial art. I would say that it was through their works that Chinese martial arts really achieved a new spiritual dimension in this time when China was facing challenges from the West. So we find in the book they talk about something related to Qi, related to Confucian idea. So the so-called Hao Ren Ji Qi, noble spirit, which was an idea from Mengzi. And according to Mengzi, noble spirit can be developed to great levels of quantity and stability by correctly nourishing it and not damaging it to the extent that it fills the space between heaven and earth. In developing qi, if you are connected with a sense of justice and the way, you will never be in want of it. It is something that is produced by cultivating a sense of justice, and it's not something that you can grab from superficial attempts at justice. If you act without mental composure, you will become qi-starved. So this is the idea of Mengzi. But if you look at the work of Chen Xin, Lutang, and Xue Dian, they try to relate the fixed form and the practice of muscles with the cultivation of inner Hao Ren Ji Qi, noble spirit. Just look at these 3 quotations from Chen Xin, from Lutang, and Xue Dian. You find that they try to relate this thing from Chen Xin's work, a pictorial explanation of Qian Taiji, and from Lutang's the study of Taiji Quan, and Xue Dian's interpretation of imitative styles. You find that they always believe that practicing the martial arts cultivates the spirit and the qi energy inside your body. So from the inner to the outer, for Chen Xin, martial arts seek self-cultivation as well as self-defense. The longer one practices, the more power he or she accumulates. Perfection will finally be achieved. So you practice Chinese martial art. On the one side, you are capable of self-defense. At the same time, self-cultivation slowly develop inside your body. Sun Lutang as well. Knowledge accompanies practice. Virtues grow along with the body. That means you practice your martial arts, you gain in knowledge as well as fighting skills, and you practice martial arts, virtues grow along with the body. Xue Dian also believed Chinese martial art could purify our heart and improve our personalities. So this is, I think this YouTube is available and you can watch it yourself. Just look at this first picture, which is particularly important. You see two sets of a circle, I would say that, one belt in black, one belt in white. The black belt represents the movement of man's flesh, blood, and energy, and the white belt represent the inner. By practicing the Taiji, Tuishou, by moving your bodies, and in the inner part of your body, in your inner energy and qi also grow correspondingly. So this is one very important thing that they put forward, that by practicing your body, by practicing the Taiji Tuishou, you not only train your body, you train your qi and inner energy as well. So now we came to the very important part of Confucianism. So you practice, eventually you reach an equilibrium between the inner and the outer, between your body and your soul. That is the highest ideal of Confucianism. 至中和, that means reaching the moral equilibrium and the moral harmony, balancing the body, balancing the soul, from the body to the soul and the soul to the body. And this continuous circulation professionalize our personalities. And eventually, a martial artist would become a sage. So I better stop here. Once again, I reaffirm my my argument. Only as late as in the late 19th century that the martial artists, particularly a very small group of people who practice martial arts alongside Confucian education, began to talk about how the spiritual dimension can be facilitated by the martial arts training. So it was a very late part of the Chinese martial art, not in the early time. So I think many of you have read this the story about Xu Xiaodong and Lei Lei. And Lei Lei is a man who practiced Taiji, and Xu Xiaodong is a MMA practitioner. Eventually, they came to a fight several years ago, and Lei Lei lost a real battle. And I use this to conclude my presentation. The spiritual side of Chinese martial art came to shape in the late 19th century. But was it a new dimension or just an escape into mysticism in the time when Western science and Western sports came to China? Was this only an escape? This is my conclusion here. Thank you.